You can see here next week the subject-specific lectures, and each of the three individuals who've got a date and a time are real old hands at this, real pros. These are worth doing. They really are. I think Professor Weitz is perhaps indisposed. I'm working on trying to secure a date and a time for. Of course, we'll let you know if we get that secured. If we don't manage, please accept my apologies in advance. We have tried. Okay, and this afternoon at 2 o'clock, it has to be 2 rather than compressed today, Professor Tim Quinlan is coming by to talk about field work. And as I've said to you before, you can't do better than an anthropologist and an experienced doctoral supervisor. He knows a lot about field work. And a lot of people make blithe assumptions about field work. Oh, I'm going to go to the field. It doesn't matter whether it's provincial hospitals or the other side of Southern Africa. And yeah, I'll issue a questionnaire and I'll talk to people. It doesn't work like that. It requires really meticulous care. And the more dependent your work is on field work, the more important it is to prepare it and get it right, because you don't get 2 shots at it. A lot of really promising dissertations get seriously delayed or fall over because the field work is badly prepared. So it matters. And even if you're not planning to do field work, it's worth knowing about. Okay, now, I'm also going to do another interactive session, the last. So immediately after this, I'll give you time for a cup of tea. If you've not been upstairs and don't know where it is, I'll gather you here, we'll go upstairs. If you've already been once, you're most welcome back, either to ask me questions or help others or just listen and watch. It'll be fine. I don't care if there's only one of you. It's still worth my time. So don't feel you've got to make up the numbers. It's not like that. Most of this is, what's the title of this? Come on. The title is Writing, Citations, and Bibliography. And most of what I have to say is actually pretty straightforward. But it always helps to make things that seem obvious once you've heard them again explicit. It's always obvious when you hear it, but it helps to be told very, very directly. And that's some of it. There are a few things in here you may not have thought of or don't know. Writing is hard. It's always hard. It's hard for established academics. It's hard for people who make a living at writing. It just is. So you've got to, even as you're learning the craft, and I know most of you have written an MA dissertation, but that just gets you in the door here. Your career as writers really begins at doctoral level because of the sheer scale of the work and because of the investigative character and because of the kind of supporting detail that's in it. It's a very specialist kind of work. But first things first, it's writing a doctoral dissertation is about finding your voice. And I mean that quite sincerely and quite directly. You too have a voice. And by that I mean something more than style. Because you're engaged in a 3-year effort to express something, to investigate, and then express an argument that's close to your heart. I cheerfully assume you're going to do something that really matters to you. And one of the early, really interesting things you can do as you're reading is to find a work, a writer, or an article that really appeals to you in terms of style. I found at least a couple through the course of my doctoral work. And I think I told you that one is a style that's so simple and so compelling, I still aspire to it. It's still a source of inspiration to me. But that said, I'll never get there entirely because I have a different voice. My own style, unlike this simple, compelling one, is rather more rhetorical. My sentences are longer. My sentence constructions are different. And yet it really helps me to know that there are other equally clear, equally precise ways of doing it. And you're not going to ape a style that you like, but you will, as you're reading, think, my, this construction is so simple, and yet the argument is so powerful, or the sentences are so beautifully made, or there's a great deal of emphasis on precision, or across the span of 20 pages you think, this is like reading a story. How does he do that? And sometimes, in addition to absorbing the intellectual content, it's worth paying attention to how a writer does what she does. Sometimes you pick it up by absorption. Sometimes you pick it up implicitly without even noticing. It won't happen if you don't read a lot. Read a lot. Okay. I can't say this often enough. Writing is thinking. Do not ever come into my office and say, I know what I want to say, but I just can't put it down on paper. If you say that, you're mistaken. You're wrong. You're delusional. That is, anything that can be thought clearly can be written down. We all do it. Me too. You're out in the garden, you're cooking your dinner, and you think, oh right, I know what I want to say. And you get this certain feeling, you get an aura, and you think, I've got it, I've cracked it. Then you go back up to your desk 3 hours later, and you think, what was that? What was that thought? Yeah, we all have it. If I'm out exercising, if I'm in the gym or going for a run, and the perfectly expressed sentence comes into my mind, at the risk of looking insane in public, I say it out loud, so I'll remember it. It's the only way you remember. My real point is that don't persuade yourself you understand. If you understand the test, the first, last, most immediate, most effective test of the clarity of your thought is writing. And because what you thought was a clear idea sometimes takes 2 or 3 attempts, 2 or 3 different ways of phrasing it. That's what I mean when I say writing is thinking. Okay. I've received over the years at BA, MA, MPhil, PhD level drafts that where I felt that the ink was still wet. In other words, it was drafted very, very quickly by someone, and it shows. A first draft almost always shows. A lot of professional writers, including people like novelists, believe that the real writing happens after you've done the first draft. Because the part of the craft, and in fact an integral part of the craft of writing a doctoral dissertation, is actually being very precise. The precision of the sentences and the paragraphs is a subset of the narrative coherence, the way a relatively simple story proceeds. And it takes a lot of work to do that, a lot. If you have to draft a chapter 2 times or 3 times, or you bring a chapter to your supervisor and think, that's that done, I don't have to think about it again, and the supervisor says, you need to rewrite this. Don't be astonished or disappointed. It's part of your supervisor trying to honor your intelligence and your dedication. We're all learning all the time how to write. Okay. Now, everybody's got their own way. Everyone has their own way about writing. I'm astonished by the way some people go about it. Many of my colleagues and a good many of my students say, right, when I've read enough, when I've got a plan, I'll simply sit down and I'll blast through the first 8,000 to 10,000 words. Roughly, a chapter is often 8,000 to 10,000 words. And without worrying about precision or a great deal about coherence beyond following the plan, without worrying about typos or anything else, they blitzkrieg it. They go right out to the end. And then they go back. And sometimes it takes 2 or 3 goes. So they'll go back and they'll clean it up. Then they'll go back and they'll insert all the references. Then they'll go back again and work on the sentences and maybe change paragraph orders and all that. That seems to me to be a long, tedious way to do it. But it works for some people. If it works for you, do that. I tend to be what I would call the other extreme. I tend, on the whole, to chisel out every bit as I'm going. I almost never move on to another paragraph until I think I've got it just the way I want it, including the references and everything. That may be a little control freaky, perhaps. I don't know, but it works for me. So that's what I do. So there is no single best way. But whichever way you do it, you've got to be very careful. And it doesn't flow off. It doesn't just flow out of you perfectly. It almost never does. In all of my academic career, I only know one individual who could do that, and he was world famous. I was well acquainted with him briefly, and he used to dictate chapters of his books into a microphone, and then have someone type them out. I don't know about you, but I can't speak prose. Heaven knows how he did that. But he was exceptional, and I'm not even tempted to try to imitate it. We mortals have to spend a lot of time getting it right. Okay. Always have a plan. Nobody likes planning. Nobody wants to do a plan. I don't want to do a plan. It seems to get in the way. You know, I'm full of energy. I've got the time. Everything's quiet. My machine's not coughing and spluttering. Right, now I can make tracks. Don't make tracks in the jungle. You'll get lost. When you've got a really long piece, say a chapter, typically 8,000 to 10,000 words, if you've only got 3 or 4 subsections indicated, that's like trying to cross a roaring river by leaping from boulder to boulder. It's risky. It's much better to put stones in between each of those big set pieces. And because even before you start then, you can see the shape of it. And remember, typically it comes to a point. You know, each chapter is trying to be a curtain raiser at the end for the next chapter. You know, you're always coming to a point. And it's much, much easier if you've got a plan. And the more steps along the way you've got, the less likely you are to spend time scratching your head thinking, well, what next? Maybe I ought to put these couple of paragraphs earlier, or maybe I need to fill something in here. That can still happen, but it won't be so major, and it'll happen less often. Have a plan. By all means, be prepared to change the plan if you find that in the writing it doesn't quite work out. No plan ever survives the writing. I mean, even your research proposal won't survive your further research and writing, but it keeps you roughly on track. You're headed to a destination, and if you deviate a little from the plan, that's okay. It's a deviation, not a sort of feeling your way through the jungle. Plan. I know you don't want to. That's why it's important. It always tells you. You know, when you wake up in the morning and you think, what shall I do? You should probably do the thing you least want to do. Usually. Okay, plan. Citations. Oh, and it's hard because it's creative. You know, I'm trying to encourage you not to despair. There are moments when it feels like you're trying to pick up mercury and it just drops into little bits. There are times when it feels you're running a marathon and it's never going to end. You can expect that. Or there are times you're staring at the screen and you think, the words just won't come. This is normal. That's part of creative life. It gets easier in the broad sense, if you like, at a strategic level. But day to day, I can't guarantee that every day is going to be easier than the last. But by the time you're writing chapter 6 or chapter 7, you'll know you've got it. You'll know. Okay, citations. This and no other university I know of has a house style for citations. This is footnotes and endnotes. Some departments insist on it. Some departments even insist on certain kinds of fonts. I find myself resisting that kind of thing. But there's no house style. In other words, if you want to use superscript, that is a footnote, the little number at the end of a word, and then the footnote either at the bottom or the end note at the back, or if you want to use Harvard style, so the prose is going, and that's why supply chain logistics are so important. Full stop, and then it would, or before the full stop, it would say Whitman 2015, page 6 if it was a quote. That's the Harvard style, where the references are explicit in the text. It's a matter of preference. It's partly a matter of what looks better on the page for you, but also just the ease with which you can enter things. I prefer endnotes myself, but I'm not prepared to defend it against all comers. You should use what's best for you. I read literature all day and all night, and some of it's Harvard, and some of it's superscript. Okay, fine. You just accommodate yourself. The reason I personally don't like Harvard is because I cite a lot, and I think it just gets in the reader's way if in the middle of a sentence it says Whitman 2015, MacArthur 2018, semicolon, somebody else 2005. It just seems to clutter it up on the page. It's a perfectly well-established convention, and you're entitled to use it. But here are the 3 golden rules for citations. Whether it's Harvard or superscript, you go to the footnotes. In the case of Harvard, it's the bibliography. In the case of footnotes, it's at the bottom or the end of the chapter. 3 golden rules. Citations have to be clear, they have to be complete, and they have to be consistent. And that's all you need to do. I don't care if it says Jim Whitman, comma, title of the article, or whether it says Whitman, comma, Jim, or whether the dates after the name or the dates at the end, so long as whatever style you adopt consistently, so long as they all look the same. All right? And it's clear, complete, and consistent. The golden rule for any citation, it's print. I'll say that in a minute. This is not nerdy. This is not fussy. This is not an old man's preference for neatness and order. This is scholarly precision. One of the worst things that can happen as an external examiner is to pick up a dissertation you've been asked to assess and see that the citations are sloppy. As soon as I see that, I go straight to the bibliography and I think, oh no, it's a mess. It's so easy to be precise about this. And it's a real mark of scholarly dedication and precision to get this right. And it's not difficult. It's tedious. It's boring. But then I once saw an interview with a famous composer, and he said, it's so boring. And I thought, composing music for an orchestra, how can that be boring? And he elaborated. He said, well, sure. I mean, you get a nice musical idea, and then for 40 instruments of an orchestra, you've got to put all the violins, a single note, and all the cellos and everything, all the way down. He said, knitting's more exciting than composing music. And it made me realize that behind great works of art, and your dissertation would of course be a work of art, is a lot of bone-crunching labor. But if he gets the note wrong, the orchestra sounds, it sounds wrong. So the precision matters. Okay. Which style? This is really interesting. What counts as a legitimate or worthwhile source? A lot of dissertations refer only to academic literature. That's fine. That's easy. The legitimacy is not a problem. If you're citing a book published by Harvard University Press, I don't think you have to worry too much about whether it's reliable. Or if it's published by one of the mainline publishers, journal publishers, you don't have to worry too much about that either. The famous authors, the lead authors in the field, of course, all that's easy. It gets a little more difficult when you begin to move away from the standard academic literature. And the first thing I want to say here is to assure you that it doesn't have to be academic. You know, there's more to the world of knowledge. There's more to the world of reliable information and data than academic life. I was once privy to some analyses, global security analyses, sort of high-level political analyses conducted by Shell Oil Company. I was deeply impressive. I thought, where do you get your data? Well, by having millions and millions to spend on it, I expect. And this was an oil company. I can assure you that the insurance companies do some absolutely first-rate research, first-rate. So there's more to good and reliable research than academics. You've also got international bodies. The research published by the United Nations Children's Fund, by the World Health Organization, by the Food and Agriculture, all the UN specialized agencies and programs, they too are wholly reliable. But you have to exercise your judgment. Once you begin moving away from academe, from international organizations, from respected think tanks, you need to begin to think carefully. I once had I had to examine an MPhil dissertation. It was about the conflict in Kosovo, and there was a heavy reliance on a website that wasn't even named. It was just, you know, http ... I thought, what is this? And it was a pro-Serbian, or I don't know, or pro-Albanian website. It was a political activist website. You know, they didn't pretend to be unbiased or pretend to be. Once you looked at who we are and what we do, and I thought, did you not look? Did you care so little that just because it supported what you thought, that you thought it was a legitimate source? If in doubt, check. If still in doubt, ask your supervisor. And there's other forms of grey literature as well. It's perfectly legitimate to quote a newspaper. I wouldn't rely heavily for my argument on one, but they're very, very useful for citing, for reports of current events, that kind of thing. If, for example, I was talking about the banking industry, and I was looking at banking scandals. You've all read about, you know, the banks that have been fined for money laundering and corrupt practices. Newspapers are really quite useful for that, because you can go into a newspaper website and you can say, on the 15th of July 2008, Bank X was fined so much for, and then there's a citation. It's the New York Times or the Guardian or something like that. That's fine. That's okay. You need to distinguish between matters of well-supported argument and matters of opinion. So your judgment matters once you begin swimming away from the academic literature. And there are a lot of think tanks out there, especially in Europe and North America, which have a political agenda. Some of the work, I have to say, is high quality. You know, they certainly reach an academic standard, but you have to be very careful about the provenance of these things. You know, I mean, they are a lot of them. A lot of think tanks are ideologically funded. They're ideologically oriented. So always when you approach a think tank website, you go to the who we are and what we do bit and just check. Part of your judgment is going to depend too on how much reliance you're making on these. If it's background information, if you're trying to demonstrate a variety of opinion on a certain situation, it's a little easier. But in general, try not to rely too much on one or two key authors. I'll sometimes see that at doctoral level in the opening literature chapters. And the same two authors keep coming up over and over and over again. And I think, have you really surveyed the field? Is the literature that poor? And I'm inclined to believe generally it's that poor. I have actually gone to the trouble sometimes of going into library websites to check to see whether the literature is more extensive than the student indicates. External examiners will do that. Okay. So, oh, and the other thing about citations is please, please, please never put down a website without saying what it is. I don't care, even if it says HTTP, colon, UN Development Program, You've got to start with UN Development Program. You know, if all I've got is a website, you're wasting my time because I will look. I will look. It always, when the author or the source, the organization, if you like, of this web reference isn't listed, it looks like you're hiding it. That's what it looks like. And it's just not scrupulous, it's not precise. So make sure you remember what I said, clear, complete, and consistent. And the test for clear, complete, and consistent is whatever you've listed, I don't care whether it's a newspaper article or a book or an article or a think tank website or something, I ought to be able to go straight to the library and find it without any further ado. I have assisted students over the years finding certain things in libraries because they've got pretty good library access. And I'll say to them, I'll get what you want in this area, but I need a complete bibliographic, all the details. And then I wind up wasting time because they haven't mentioned volume 5, number 6, or they haven't given me the date, for heaven's sake. What's your dissertation going to look like if you can't even give me the full bibliographic details? So you've got to be in the habit of completeness and precision all along. It's part of being a pro. Oh, we have to do all this in addition to being creative? Yes, frankly. I'm sorry if that's terribly crushing, but you'll recover. Start your bibliography today. Don't start it after you've written your last chapter. You'll forget stuff, it'll be a mess, and you won't be able to recover certain quoted passages. If you're keeping electronic notes, if you're reading an article and you think, oh, that's a beautiful passage, that expresses some of the background that I'm interested in, it expresses it beautifully, and you cut it and paste it and stick it in your notes. Never, never do that without putting the bibliographic detail under it. You'll weep real tears trying to find the source of it 2 years later. So this is again meticulous, scrupulous, consistent application. And it's also easier to make and keep things precise if you're doing the bibliography as you go along. So you bring back 3 articles and 2 books from the library. First thing you do, enter them onto your bibliography. If all you do is sit on one of the books, okay, you can always delete it, because that's intellectual honesty. But if you use them, if you refer to them, if they've been helpful to you even a little bit, it's not only legitimate, it's right and proper that you should enter them. So first things first, put it in the bibliography. Do it first. It's easy. You'll feel you're making progress because you're typing, even though you're just being a clerk. All right. And don't forget the page citations for quoted material. Don't forget. Some bibliographies are very large. That's okay. But some of them also span a number of different literatures. I've seen this quite often. If you were looking at, say, the legal regulation of biotechnology, you would probably have scientific works, and you would have legal works, and you might have academic works, or some dissertations have books and articles, but they also have, say, United Nations declarations. Suppose you were looking at peacekeeping operations or something. There'd be a whole raft of UN resolutions. And they might also have, I don't know, other forms of official documentation. So if you're looking at a single nation's participation in a UN peacekeeping operation, you'd have the UN documentation in one section, and you'd have the say, government announcements and pronouncements and laws in another, and books and articles. It's just a way of helping the reader, especially if you're using Harvard and they have to find the reference in the bibliography rather than at the back of the page. It's very helpful for them to be able to scan down it, and it keeps you ordered as well. Okay. Okay. Can I find the article directly? Always a bad sign. If I cut and paste your URL and I stick it into Google and the article doesn't come up, oops. How reliable is this? And sometimes, well, in fact, it's on the next page. I'll do it in a minute. No, here it is. Some researchers really like covering their back. It's a kind of insurance thing. So right at the end of an internet citation, they'll say accessed on 20th of September 2019 when you looked at it, because things do disappear. They disappear, and it's a way of covering your back. And I know at least one publisher, a very large international book publisher, Routledge, where they insist on it. All internet citations need to have accessed at. And yes, when I published a book with Routledge, I got into trouble because I didn't know when I'd accessed it. So I made a best guess. Yeah, that's a confession. And you're not, stop writing that down. Turn that off, please. But what I did do, as a matter of scholarly scrupulousness, is to ensure that they were still there. Okay. Heavens. All right. Anybody got any questions about any of this stuff? I've foregone giving you the particulars of citation. Your doctoral students, I'm not going to get into, well, what happens if I'm trying to cite a quote that's in a chapter in an edited book that's, you know, it's got 3 layers. How do I do? No, you work it out. One of the things that I would recommend if you're struggling with citations is find an article or a chapter or something that has the full range. It cites books, it cites chapters in edited books, it cites websites, it cites journals. And if you like the style, adopt that style. And you can just take a page of the bibliography and stick it up on your wall, and it's always there. If in doubt, how did X do it? And it becomes your style. It's the quickest, dirtiest, but easiest way of adopting this clear, consistent, and complete. And if it's already published in the professional literature, you can bet it satisfies all 3. So just have a template, if you like. You got questions about this? It's actually pretty straightforward. It's part of the craft of doing a doctorate, but that doesn't mean it's minor, right? Because your work has to be well supported. Yes. Mm-hmm. If you're using superscript, that is, you know, footnote 3, footnote 4, and all that, it doesn't matter whether it's at the end of the chapter or at the end of the whole work. I go from the superscript and see the footnote. But you also have a bibliography. You cannot submit a dissertation that does not also have a bibliography. So that's the bibliography rather than a citation. And that's why some people like Harvard, they do it once. They don't have to do it twice. I'd rather go through the tedious trouble. Don't even think about submitting a dissertation without a bibliography. You know, no is the answer. Okay? Yes, sir.
How many books or articles?
I was waiting for that.
Always that question.
Well, I'll give a smart-ass question with a smart-ass answer, which is as many as it takes. I mean, and I'm okay. That's the jokey side, but it's also literally the case. I mean, sufficient to substantiate your hypothesis is the answer. sufficient to bring enough evidence to bear to support the case you're making. And one of the points about reading dissertations, and indeed even just reviewing them, is to get a sense of the intellectual weight of them. Because that's what that is. You know, the number of supporting documents is a fair part of what I would call the intellectual weight of a piece. I have examined some which had so many footnotes they got in the way of the prose. And that's not a good thing. That is, like I said yesterday, like too much parsley on a bad steak. And remember, I also told you that you can also use citations to indicate sub-literatures that you know are related, but not directly pertinent. In your case, now this gentleman is thinking about using the term governance, and he's already discovered there's a proliferation not only of literature about governance, but definitions of governance. It's applied in all kinds of ways. Well, one of the things he would do, if his argument depended on a definition of governance, would be to say, there is, acknowledge that there's a vast literature and say, there are three broad uses of it. The term global governance has often been used in the literature, and when you use a phrase like that, you're signaling citation coming up. Has often been used in the literature footnote. For example, see, and you can cite 3 or 4 books there. That's that definition done. It has also been used in respect of subject-specific governance, which is not the concern here. Footnote again. So you get one citation, doesn't clutter everything up, but you also signal to the reader at the same time, yeah, I know the literature. I'm choosing a very specific aspect of it, but I didn't just fall over it. I've tramped over the whole territory. So it keeps it clean, but also makes it strong. So that's basically how to do it. I like fighting you guys to a standstill. All right, here's a roundup of the mantras. I shall leave you to look at these. Yes, you can. Okay. Thank you for coming along. Thank you for your splendid participation. And we're going to have one more so-called interactive session, and we'll have some fun doing that. It's been lots of fun working with you. Thank you very much. Thank you.